Welcome back to The Truth on the Gamer Muscle YouTube channel. A series of videos where we simply talk about the truth when it comes to games. The good points and the bad points. And we won't hold back and we'll probably burn a couple of bridges in the process. Today's game is The Mage's Tale, which just came out the other day on the Oculus Store, and as you might have noticed from the shaky GoPro-like footage, it's a virtual reality title and takes full advantage of motion control, touch controllers and everything. It's a full-on VR title. Now the game itself is a RPG puzzle-based dungeon crawler. In essence, the gameplay revolves around going through individual levels, working out the puzzles through those levels to then progress the story and build your character whilst unlocking potions that you can then use to create your own spells, which you can then use as weapons against the enemies that are in some of the dungeons. There is some real-time combat in this. That was probably the worst description of a game possible. Now, let's get straight onto the good and the not-so-good points of this game. That's what we're here for with The Truth. Now, the first thing with this game... let's start with good things. Let's be positive. The first thing that really stands out with this game is it's bloody hell, it's polished. And it does actually feel like a proper title. There's so many VR games that have come out in the last year or so that, you know, they might have nice gameplay to them or certain aspects of gameplay that are nice and they might be a little bit polished, but they don't feel like a proper game that you go to a shop, pick it up and put it in your games console or buy on Steam and play on your PC. They just feel like indie titles. You'll be glad to know this feels like a proper rounded game. Fantastic. There's like 4 of them for VR at the moment. So good job by the developers for making an actual game. And what makes it feel like a proper game is that not only is it just overall there's a lot of polish there, but the things like the voice acting are really well done. The script is really well written. Sure, at times it does feel a bit childish and, you know, it's very much in that sort of PG nature of writing. But they've actually injected good amounts of humour in there. Some subtle, more adulty jokes that obviously a child would miss, but a bit of innuendo at times. It's just really nicely written and really done. And the actual feeling I get just playing through this was as if I was in a 1980s sort of Jim Henson-esque type film. If you really like films like Labyrinth, Never-Ending Story, you know, there's loads of them. 80s to early 90s blockbuster kids films. If you like them, then I think you'll really enjoy the general vibe that this game puts off through its script, through its humour, and just through its overall execution. The developers also done a really good job with actually being creative with the game mechanics and using VR in creative ways. What has driven me a little bit crazy with many VR games at the moment, over the last year or so, is that we seem to have this job simulator syndrome. Now, Job Simulator is fantastic, really good humour, and it does what it does really well. And Job Simulator, I think, is one of those. It was a really good first VR title. If you're going to say to someone, here's a game to play when you first get VR, fantastic. But you only need one Job Simulator. We don't need 30 games that are essentially, here's the instruction, execute that instruction. Oh, but everything's a bit clumsy, so it's hard to execute that instruction. As I say, it was fine in Job Simulator and maybe 1 or 2 other games, but there's just so many games that have turned into that, even when it wouldn't necessarily make sense for the context of those games. And I'm done with them. I'm done. We've moved on from that. That's the early learning centre VR. You know, we literally just came out of the womb fresh and we needed to learn how to use our hands. That was great. We've moved on from that now. We're on to primary school now. And though The Mage's Tale does have quite a bit of hand-holding, especially at the beginning, which I think is fine because you're learning how to play the game, there are moments where you actually have to use your brain a bit and solve the puzzles by thinking. Now, the puzzles aren't necessarily the hardest puzzles in the world to work out, but, you know, it's like a proper game where you have to actually use a bit of thought to get through them without someone just hand-holding you all the time. And working out the puzzles is often through environmental clues. An early on puzzle, for example, you have to use orbs to unveil patterns on the wall to then know how you need to move some columns so that the patterns are displayed the same on the columns in the environment. And I think what makes it compelling is that not only do you have to think about it yourself to actually work it out and not be told, but also you're using your hands and you're also taking advantage of aspects that only VR could deliver. So you might have seen some of these puzzles and some of these designs in 2D games before, the general concepts, but then because you're doing them in VR with your hand controllers and having finer dexterity on moving things about and interacting with things in the environment, it actually feels quite new. And even for those of us that are old, grumpy and have played far too many games and been completely irresponsible with their time, ends up being really enjoyable. And I can only imagine if you gave this to a child that's not played other sort of RPG games or crawlers in the past, it would generally be quite a mind-blowing experience. I'm going to throw a negative in. We've got more positives, but I'm going to throw a negative in because I think that the England being warm all of a sudden has somehow caused us to be too positive and has removed our cynicism. We need to, so we're going to throw some negativity in here. So let's get the biggest negative out of the way. The absolute worst thing with this at the moment are the load times, and I don't think they completely ruin the game, but there are times where you're sat there with your VR headset on the face and there's this little rotating triangle that sort of stutters as it loads. And I mean, I'm running on an i7 6700K overclocked to 4.3 gigahertz. I've got a SSD hard drive and a 1070. It shouldn't be taking this long to load. You sort of, I don't know, I didn't time it with a stopwatch, but you're talking a couple of minutes at times. When you first load the game, you probably die of old age before it loads. Once you've done that bit, anytime you go back to the cauldron to develop and build new spells, which you have to do quite a lot, you're talking again 10, 15, 30 seconds of this rotating triangle with a Gaelic woman or child singing the same song at you. And it's not a bad song, it's quite nice, quite emotional, quite moving, but it goes from being, that's quite pleasant and gets you into the spirit of the game, to, dear God, if I hear this woman say fatty whatever in Gaelic one more time, I'm going to put my face through a window. Absolutely driving me to despair, the load times in this game. Definitely motivates you not to die, because when you die again, that's another 10 to 15 to 30 second load time. So that will get the tension going. But yeah, the developer really needs to look at ways to improve the load times with this title, because that, I think, is the worst part of the game. Fortunately, other aspects of the game are so good that you can put up with it, and it's the type of game where you're not going to be dying that often and you're generally just taking your time, so it's not as noticeable as it would be if it was more of an action type game. But yes, it's a problem, probably the worst thing about the game at the moment. Stoking the negativity fire, I think another aspect of the game that could be improved on is the player movement. Now, this is, you know, it's arguably not that bad. At times, the player movement's fine. When it comes to the core sort of puzzle aspect of levels, when you've not got NPCs that you're fighting against, and you can just take all the time in the world, the fact that the developer's giving you a choice of teleportation and then this sort of grid nudge movement is really nicely done. In terms of basic comfort, it's actually very comfortable to play, and I don't think it'll trigger that much motion sickness, and the movement does add to immersion. Where the motion is problematic is when it comes to combat against NPCs. As you progress through the game, you get more and more NPCs spawning into various parts of the game where, you know, the sort of combat scenarios which intersperse the puzzle sections of the game. And the game, it would seem from the way the combat is, it does encourage you to move around and outmaneuver them. There's a lot of dodging involved. A lot of the enemies have ranged weapons where you pay to dodge left and right and then move forwards and around. And then you have enemies that actually try and charge at you and are close range enemies. So you do have to approach it in some ways how you'd actually play the original Doom. And just the way that you dart around and then you can't use the snap rotation that precisely at times, it can really end up feeling quite disorientating and just a bit janky and hard to be precise in where you want to move your character to. Now, this has been brought up with the developer, and one of the things that they are looking at doing is implementing a sort of glide, you know, artificial locomotion rather than just a nudge locomotion, something more classic to your typical first-person shooter movement, which might make it a little bit more seamless, but of course the risk there is that makes some people motion sick. But I think it's good to have that as an option on top of what they've already got in the game, and maybe with that it won't be as problematic, or it's not really problematic, it's just irritating and very hard to get around at this point in time. And one of the things I found myself doing to approach the game is, rather than actually dodging about and moving about, is actually using the shield more, and then just being very careful when I do go in a corner and using spells that accommodate a more passive way of approaching the levels. Which is a little bit disappointing. I like to be a little bit more active in moving around and avoiding stuff. But, you know, there's ways to approach it, but it's not ideal. And we'll see what the developer does with that in the future. But for now, I'd say that the general movement, when it comes to the combat specifically, is definitely a negative with this game. Now, when it comes to basic object interaction, I think the developer's actually done a really good job with how they've allowed you to pull objects towards you by using the grip controller. You point your finger at the object and it will then glow, showing that you're pointing at it. Sometimes, whether or not you're pointing at it can be a bit ambiguous. You really do have to take your fingers off the controller and point at it, and then it's clear to actually aim at what you're pointing at, and then it makes sense. Until you work that out, it can sometimes feel a bit off. You think, why isn't that being selected to then make me grab it towards me? But once you've got the hang of that, the way you actually grab objects and they come towards you with the grip controller is really well done. And then things like the doors, you have to pull a handle on them by grabbing a lever. You don't have to physically put your hand on the lever. You could just be stood near it, and it will automatically, like sort of a Rayman hand, go to it, and then you just use the grip controller, and it's really nicely done, and it gets rid of that that feeling that you've just got all this, you have to put this extra effort into a game. I think a lot of early VR titles go a bit overboard with trying to make it so that you have to go and grab onto everything really super precise and put your hand actually there and pull it, and it's like, no, that's not fun. It's just a chore. It's just a simple fact that if you had Jedi mind powers, that would, you know, that's a far more enjoyable way to interact with the world. So why not just give everyone Jedi mind powers? Sure, this game's context of magic explains it, so maybe that makes it feel more seamless than if this was a realistic game. But I like it, and I think it's really, really well done and very smoothly executed. And it's not an easy thing to do. So again, congratulations, developer. Another really nicely done feature of the game. Now, when it comes to the audio, it's a sort of mixed bag. The general audio in this game is really fantastic. As I say, the voice acting and the execution of the voice, the script and everything, that aspect of the audio is fantastic. And the environmental sounds are absolutely superb as well. Very immersive, really add to feeling like you're in the environment. So, for the most part, the audio is really well done in this. The only really big niggle I have with the audio is sometimes it doesn't sync up to the character's animated lips, which is something you notice in VR much more than you notice in a 2D game. And then again, also when characters turn away from you, whilst they're talking, the audio doesn't get quieter. So again, that just makes it feel like the audio is separate from the character. Again, something you wouldn't notice on a 2D game, but in VR. And especially in a game like this where you are really focusing on when characters are talking, and the animations on the characters are generally really good, so it makes you focus on them. That just really breaks the immersion because the sound doesn't then correlate to what's going on the screen. Personally, I don't think it's that bad. It does ruin a little bit of the immersion, but overall the sound design is so good and so immersive that I forgive them. I forgive them for not doing everything perfectly, but it is something you will notice. In conclusion, I would say personally, I've really enjoyed this, and that's the main thing with the game. Sure, the load times are irritating, sure there's some annoyances in it, but for the most part, it's a really bloody enjoyable game. And as I say, the main thing for me, the enjoyment, comes from the fact that I feel like I'm in an 80s blockbuster movie, and just the humour and the execution of that humour through the dialogue and the gameplay. Now, I have only played for a couple of hours so far, so what really remains to be seen is how long it takes to actually finish the game. I have spoken to the developer previously, and they said I think they were aiming for around about 8 to 12 hours to complete it. We'll see. I feel like I'm about a tenth of the way through the title as it is now. But so far, it's been really enjoyable, and if you can get 8 hours of it, that'd be awesome. I think it's not really got much replayability to it though, so you have to bear that in mind. Generally that is the case with more puzzle focused games. The combat mechanics in this potentially have replayability to them because the way you do make your own spells up, and it's fun to try different things out. But of course, once you know how to do various puzzles, there's no brain power involved in doing them a second time. And then, of course, the jokes, humour, dialogue, and environmental quirks, again, will be a bit flat the second time playing the game. So it's a one-time playthrough title, but I think most people will really enjoy playing it through that first time. Needless to say, I hope that was truthy enough for you guys, and let me know in the comments, especially what we call in the comments, if you guys can point out your own truths, or, you know, if you've spotted something that's a real problem with the game or really good about the game, let us know in the comments, so when I do follow up the videos I can highlight them or just highlight your comment. But remember, if you do like this format of video, please let me know as well by dropping a comment or just messaging me. Also, don't forget to click the subscribe button. Don't forget to like it or dislike it, depending on your persuasion at that point in time of clicking the button. Until the next one, thanks for watching, everybody, and goodbye.